Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our brand new study in the Spiritual Gift of Madness by Dr. Seth Farber, published in 2012. And it's a very interesting study. I'm looking forward to this. It actually is especially interesting to me when you think about the fact that in John 10:20, Jesus is accused of madness. And in Acts 26:24, Paul is accused of madness. So that gives me some context. Because obviously Christ and Paul both opposed the status quo. They both were upset by the status quo. Christ was to the point of a mania when he purged the temple, because the temple had been converted into a money-making market. And Paul was accused of madness because of what he had learned. Learning had led to his being considered mad. And so to me that gives it some biblical context. And even in these first 10 pages, we're going to see, we'll get a look at the way the author wants to define his concepts, which I think is an important way to start. So we're doing the introduction. It's just the first 10 pages. Let's go to block 1. Higher sanity within madness. The psychiatric survivors movement began in the 1970s, increasing in population to approximately 8 million, claiming the right to be different and to protest the pharmaceutical complex, protesting against the pharmaceutical complex, and to protest the perversion of the social control of deviance, and to protest the psychiatric scientific authorities, who all sanctified the adjustment to the social order. And the question is remaining, so what's the alternative vision? If we're going to oppose and critique the current vision, then what is the alternative vision? And the alternative vision, according to Dr. Farber, is spiritual, taking up the alternative spiritual vision. He says we negate postmodern pluralism. I agree with that 100%. We're talking about an initiation into a higher mode of being, crafted individually by each individual soul, negating egoism, and liberating the spiritual dunamis potentiality of the soul. And it is a spectacular processing of information, an ecstasis, a completely different way of interpreting information beyond the norm, beyond the norm. So, block 1 tells us the problem. We have conflicting visions. We have the corporate scientific authority, and then we have the vision of the psychiatric survivors movement in conflict with each other. In conflict with each other, it's time to define the concepts. Okay, I like this, that Dr. Farber begins by defining the concepts. Let's go to block 2. The concept of insanity. Insanity is a state of spiritual derangement. Sanity is living in accord with spiritual growth. Madness is the altered state of non-rational consciousness. It can be good or it can be bad. The concept of madness is non-rational consciousness, in most cases painful but good. It's a potentially valuable experience where breakdown can lead to breakthrough. It is potentially regenerative. There's a potential to become regenerative. Madness as regenerative. It's a processing of meaning and possibility. One can be both mad and sane. Insanity always involves a value judgment, denoting a negative condition. The insane can appear very well adjusted. The well-adjusted insane. They appear stable, not always psychotic. A spiritually deranged person, where one's actions always include absurdity, unintelligibility. Now the goal here for the psychiatric survivors movement is Block 2, Note 5, Achieving Patient Liberation. The Mad Pride movement, that became the new name for the psychiatric survivors movement. The Mad Pride movement began in 1999 in England, along with the Icarus Project, negating human rights violations, negating the current mental health system, seeking to reform the mental health system, promoting existential equality of all persons, negating the dominant medical model of psychology. And I like that he includes the fact that it's the model of psychology that must be revised and reformed. Because in a way, we always construct sign models of our reality. And the medical model of psychology needs reformation, says Dr. Farber. And that brings us to the all-important Block 3, changing the psychiatric narrative. Actually changing the psychiatric narrative. How do we rewrite the model? How do we rewrite the sign model of psychology? How do we change the narrative? Negating the corporate psychiatric narrative. Madness gives access to transcendent mystical life, involving a moment of decision, a decision to negate the corporate psychiatric narrative and develop an alternative narrative, affirming the alternate spiritual narrative as positive identity of the self by reinterpreting the psychotic episodes as, catch this, as revelatory experience. We could say mystical revelatory experience, without the taking of all those prescribed psychiatric drugs, and affirming a creative maladjustment. In other words, it can be a positive experience if the world is the insane world, then we need to be maladjusted to the insane world. We want to bring about change to the insane world. 7 aspects to bring about change to the insane world. Dr. Farber says there is a distinctive difference from a so-called normal person. An asset of sensibility is acquired. Psychotic episodes are reinterpreted to have value because they bring illumination of the true self for spiritual growth. It is the society that is insane, and I like this. It is an ontological sign model that has gone off course. It is derailed. It is deranged. It is society that is derailed. It is society that is deranged. It is society that is standing on its head, and that the ontological sign model for society is completely out of sync. Therefore, we seek to change the psychiatric narrative currently being affirmed by this society that is ontologically off course. And This is a book from 2012. Well, we can all agree that in 2021, it doesn't take much to see that the ontological model of society is standing on its head. It is off the rails. It is deranged. We can see that. There's no respect and affirmation of the truth. Truth is no longer something to be prized. It isn't, not in our society today. Our moral center has collapsed, and depth of meaning is absent in our current narrative. In our own 2021 ontological sign model, it is definitely deranged. It is definitely out of sync with itself and out of sync with a deeper, more meaningful center of life. We've all become the privileged. You know, everybody feels like they have a right to entitlement. The sin of pride and entitlement is dominant in 2021. So this is correct. Society is an ontological sign model, definitely off course even today, as it was in 2012 when Dr. Farber wrote this, and as it is and as it remains today. But he gives us a great beginning here, and we're just going to take 10 pages at a time because there's a lot of content in just 10 pages in this book. But just as a quick recap, let's go to block 1. And it all began with the psychiatric survivors movement in the 1970s. In the 1970s, there was a lot of liberation theology in the 1970s. You had the Latin American liberation movement with Gutierrez. You had James Cone, the Black liberation movement. You had the theological women's liberation movement. Liberation theology was huge in the 1970s, and many of those liberation theologies borrowed from Jürgen Moltmann and his book, The Crucified God. But that was the era of liberation movements, and in the 1970s, the psychiatric survivors movement also began. But it negated the corporate pharmaceutical complex, and it affirmed a new alternative spiritual vision. Look at note 3. And I like the fact that Dr. Farber says that we will negate postmodern pluralism. That is not the answer. Phenomenology and the impossibility of metaphysics, all of that, we negate postmodern pluralism because we live for that initiation into a higher mode of being, negating egoism and taking up spiritual potentiality, a new way of processing information, a new way that is ecstasis beyond normal existence, beyond the status quo. Ek, out of, stasis, normal existence, beyond normal existence, a spectacular processing of information beyond the status quo. Ecstasis, beyond, just put down there, ecstasis, beyond the status quo. Now block 2, we get our definitions. Insanity is a state of spiritual derangement. That's why society today is insane. It is off the rails. It is spiritually deranged. It has no arrangement around depth of meaning. It is deranged. Madness is an altered state of consciousness. It's not rational, it's more mystical. So it's given a different interpretation by Dr. Farber. And therefore, madness can be regenerative. It can create new being. It can create true being. It can create true spiritual being. And society can look well adjusted, even though it is deranged, even though it is off the rails, even though it is standing on its head. It can appear to be the well-adjusted way to go. And because it's not always psychotic, but it is spiritually deranged. And the goal is, of course, liberation. In the Mad Pride movement, which was the extension of the psychiatric survivors movement, began in 1999 in England, seeking to reform the corporate mental health system. It was seeking reformation to reform the corporate mental health system, negating the sign model of psychology that was currently being affirmed and practiced. And then, finally, we've got to go to 3.3. We have to wrap up with 3.3. 7 aspects to bring about reformation. There is a distinctive difference from the so-called normal person. We acquire an asset of sensibility. Psychiatric episodes are reinterpreted to have spiritual value because it is an illumination of the true self for spiritual growth. Especially if society is the insane, then our position should be one of maladjustment toward an insane society. But it's a great beginning. We get a beginning here. Like I said, we're just going to take 10 pages at a time. So next time, we're going to take a look at 10 through 20. We'll still be in the introduction. That's going to wrap up the first 10 pages on what looks to be, to me, a very good study by Dr. Seth Farber. We'll pick up next time as we continue in our introduction.